from here, but we did create a beautiful book. So
You
now all we
did, and
can do is hope that,
I've gotten lots of nice comments about the cover.
yes,
And a
yes.
lot of people are trying to take the advice of the title.
Oh yeah, including me. Okay, I'm going to begin and I'm going to read a few things about Michael Blumenthal to those of you that do not know this fabulous poet. Edward Hirsch, the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Prize, and the president of the Guggenheim Foundation, says Michael Blumenthal's quick wit and clever puns, his cranky, rueful, well-made poems can't hide the mortal pain that drives and invigorates this book of late intensities and humane understandings. Don't Die is a lively intervention, a book of mourning and celebration. I agree, 1000%.
He called me grouchy, I think, or grumpy.
I
or
know,
something.
and I'm starting to agree with him.
Well, what can you do?
What can you say? What can you say?
Yeah.
Okay, Garrison Keillor says, I've never met Mr. Blumenthal, but we've become close friends through his poetry. He and Rexroth and Cumin and Swenson, good company. And I'll
We're
read.
such close friends. Why does he never call me?
I know.
I'm kidding.
Maybe he will after this. Now, the Pulitzer Prize winning C.K. Williams, American poet, critic, and translator, said that Blumenthal has the intellect of a scholar, the sensitivity of a poet, the objectivity of a professor of law. It hardly seems possible that so many virtues can be embodied in one.
I think most people are kind of drunk when they write those things, or they've
Right,
taken a lot of drugs,
really nice.
you know. Yeah.
So tell me, when did you become when did you think officially you were a poet?
Oh, I'm still working on thinking that.
Right.
Well, you know, I, like most poets, I wrote poetry for a long time before I thought I was a poet. Most of it was pretty horrible, some of it even embarrassing. But the first time I wrote a poem that made me think, oh, this is what it feels like. This is it, and this is what I want to do. Was a poem in my first book about my grandmother, Johanna. It's called Johanna, who was blind and with whom I shared a room, and who I would wake up in the middle of the night and she would be standing naked in the moonlight.
Oh, I remember that. I remember that poem.
Yeah, and she would be peeing into a sort of porcelain metal pot, and I would hear the tinkling of the urine, and I loved her very much, and she was a wonderful grandmother. And when I wrote that poem, the last line of the poem is only the blind reach out to find me. And it was the first time I realized that,
like, that's a really cool line. That's a really,
well, yeah. Well, it's the first time I realized that your poem, you could write a poem and that the poem would know something about you that you yourself didn't know. And that was something I wanted to recapture. So that was the first time I wrote something that I didn't realize later was really awful. So I guess that was the beginning.
You know, you must have come across, you were head of the creative writing program at Harvard. So what was that like? I mean, you must have come across a lot of wonderful and horrible poets. What was that like, trying to guide students through either becoming?
Well, you know, I mean, Harvard is not your typical university, though there are many universities just as good, or, you know, but there are many, 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 many poets in Cambridge, not all having to do with Harvard. As a matter of fact, you can barely walk down the street without having to say to someone, you know, I love your new book. I've read your new book. Congratulations on your new book, and so on. So it's a bit overwhelming to a person who hadn't been around poets. I didn't get an MFA or anything. And of course, there are an awful lot of smart students, some of them very talented. So, you know, it was a different kind of place for me because I didn't come from there, and I didn't come from an MFA program, and I didn't come from a community of writers, and I hadn't even done much teaching, a little bit. But, you know, it was an exciting place. I still have students with whom I'm friends and who publish books. And, you know, just yesterday I got an email from a student who just published a book. And so it was a kind of invigorating place, but it was also kind of intimidating. You know, there were so many,
Right.
so many poets. And I discovered very early that they kind of all knew each other because either they'd been living there so long or they'd been in MFA programs and in that world. And so I came in kind of as an outsider. It took me a while to get used to that. And then I guess
How did you get that job as the head of your as an outsider because of your publications and your awards?
Well, you know, there's that Talking Heads song, "How Did I Get Here?"
Yes.
I used to sing that song to myself a lot in Harvard Square. Well, the reason I got there, I suppose, is I owe it mostly to my friend and colleague and wonderful person, and Helen Vendler, who was teaching at Harvard and who told me later that this is the way I would like it to be always, that she had picked my book out of a box of books. She was sent every book by every poet in the United States because she was a very powerful reviewer and so on. And she said that she had picked my book out of this book, a box of books. And I think I'm quoting her. She said it stopped her in her tracks. And so Helen did an awful lot, I'm sure, to bring me there. You know, I know that of the 3 finalists, 2 of us were lawyers, which was a very funny thing.
Right.
But I think I really probably owe that mostly to Helen, who was a very generous colleague, and I was particularly happy because I didn't know her, you know, and it's particularly nice when you don't have any personal connection with somebody and just you and the poetry.
I want to get more into your life and how you went from being a lawyer to a poet and traveling and everything, but would you read 1 or 2 poems to start us off?
1 or 2 poems. Okay, I don't have the book, so I have paper, the way it should be, I guess, or the way it starts off. Well, you know, this is a book, a late life book, I guess. You know, I'm 72.
Again, it's Don't Die by Michael Blumenthal.
Right. When you think a lot about, and your friends start to die on you, which is not fun. But, you know, not all the book is about dying or getting old or any of that stuff. And I hope it's not a sad book. It's partially funny, because if you don't have a sense of humor about this, you're in trouble. But I'll read a poem called It Happens, which sort of sums up a little bit this feeling we all have that aging and getting sick and dying and all that stuff happens to other people, but it ain't going to happen to us.
Right.
And then it does. So it happens. It happened to him. It happened to her. It happens to animals, plants, and the sea. It wasn't supposed to happen to me. It happens to birds and it happens to trees. It happened to Grandpa. It happened to Sue. But it was never supposed to happen to you. It happened to Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter too. It happens to all those who still want to be, but who would have thought it would happen to me? It happens to nightingales and swallows too. It happens to bonobos and to the bees. You never imagined it would happen to you. I knew them as children, as middle-aged too. My friends now on crutches in room 33. I never imagined it would happen to me. Oh well, that's the cycle, our own trinity. from youth to old age with some middling there too. It happens to all of us. Just let it be. It will happen to you, friends. It happened to me.
I love that.
And it did.
And it did, and it's happening to me. I know it's
But all kinds of good stuff happens too.
exactly.
So you wanted me to read two, right? You
Yes,
said,
let's read one
okay.
more.
So since this is my first book of advice, I've never written an advice book, but this is a book full of advice. You should never take advice from anybody, but what the hell? Anyway, I was eating dinner in a restaurant in DC a couple of years ago, and I saw the bartender was reading a book called How Not to Die. And I thought, ooh, what's that? It turned out to be a book about food, which I then bought. You know, it was all about, it was about what to eat and not to die. It's quite a big book. But then since I like to eat things that will encourage you to die young, you know, sugar, pizza, fat, bagels, I thought I'd write another version. So this is a poem called How Not to Die. And I acknowledged the book at the beginning. How Not to Die. Diet is a good place to begin. Then exercise, of course, and as much love as you are capable of, spread in as many directions as possible. Sex, too, is a good thing, especially when accompanied by tenderness and generosity. And don't forget the weather, all kinds, inclement and otherwise. Learn to love the rain, the sleet, the vast asymmetry of the stars. If someone speaks badly of you, kiss them many times until they are breathless. And if you are betrayed by a friend or a lover, bake cookies for them, cakes. Dip their noses in the bright peonies that have just emerged in your garden. Try hard to pretend that Donald Trump is not president of the United States. Imagine instead it's Nelson Mandela or a distant cousin from Kiev. Dream hard, wake in the middle of the night and write them down. Then read them to the first bird that arrives at your feeder. If you're hungry for things that are not good for you, eat them anyway. Then repent by giving your dog a big kiss on the mouth. Clothes that no longer fit you should be cut up and fashioned into abstract collages. Food that has gone bad in the fridge should be left there in perpetual hope of resurrection. Make long lists of everyone who has ever hurt you, then crumple them up and roast marshmallows with them, or else pork fat on toast. Pretend now that you will live forever. Put your arms around every self-help book you ever bought and read it aloud to the grass. Then pray for rain. Watch it grow.
Beautiful. You
Good
know,
advice.
it is good advice and it is beautiful. And it's so interesting. I love this book. I love your other poetry books as well. You've been publishing for about 40 years.
100 years, yeah.
40, no, wonderful, wonderful books. And I loved your memoir. I loved your memoir. His memoir is All My Mothers and Fathers. And that is a really beautiful book. And it shows the obsessions that you grow up with, and then they pour out in these poems. And I'm wondering what you thought this introspection and growing up the way you did, how that hurts or helps relationships that you have. I mean, you write a lot about relationships. You write a lot about love. You write about obsession with love, but then you're completely wrapped up into your own journey, you know, as most poets and writers are, you know, your own journey. So I'm just curious.
Well, you know, you wrote a memoir too, so
You're right.
I don't have to tell you. Well, you know, I think that simply comes with the territory. You know, writers are people who are introspective and are to some degree self-involved. You know, Philip Roth, who I admire very much, once said, nothing inspires me like my own life, or nothing interests me more than my own life.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's not necessarily an admirable quality,
Right.
but I think writers are people who, for some reason or another, often tragic, but not always, are kind of forced into themselves at a young age. And the poet Yeats said that poetry was a dredging operation into the unconscious. And I think mostly there's a lot of repression in people who become poets, and they're trying to get it out. So I think it's not necessarily something that prepares you for good relationships in one sense, because people who are self-involved, you know, my wife is the opposite of that.
Right. Right.
Lucky me.
Yes.
But people who are self-involved don't make the best partners. But on the other hand, I think poets are people who are looking for a cure, you know, for their own suffering and maybe for other people's. And so, on the other hand, you know, writers who are serious tend to be people who are working on themselves in some way. So, yeah, I think, you know, the biographies are full of terrible stories of trying to have relationships with poets and how horrible we all are. I don't think that's true, but there's some truth to it. You know, it is. I think novelists tend to be less self-involved because they have to spend more time. You can't fill 500 pages with yourself,
Right.
and so at least not at once.
Right.
And so you have to spend some time paying attention to the world and other people. Poets maybe tend to do less of that.
Mhm. That is so interesting. Would you read, please, one of my favorite poems?
If I can find it, sure.
Oh, book buying.
Oh.
If you can't find it,
Well,
I'll read it.
I can't find it. It's right over here somewhere. Yeah, it's here. It's long, so I wasn't going to read it, but thanks for asking.
I love it.
Well, you know, the book is the poem is deeply
Again,
influenced by.
don't die. Let me tell anybody that has listened to us this long that you can buy this book at rabbithousepress.com. You can also get it. It's publication day, November 11th, 2021. And you can also get it on Amazon, Ingram, Barnes and Noble, and your local
And your bookstore, your neighborhood small bookstore.
your neighborhood
small independent bookstore.
Small. Don't Die, poems by Michael Blumenthal. And he's about to grace us with one of my faves, because bookstores are my favorite place. And I love this.
Well, so yeah, book buying. Well, that's the appropriate segue into a poem called Book Buying. It's very much influenced by a very famous poem of Philip Larkin's called Church Going. And I stole the first two lines from Larkin's poem. Larkin's poem is about entering a church when, in fact, you are doubtful about belief. And mine is about entering bookstores at a time when you're a bit doubtful about literature or what its future is, or what serious books' future are. So this is a sestina. I'm sorry, not a sestina. It's a rhyming poem, which imitates Larkin's rhymes, and it's rather long. Book buying. Just when I'm sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door blow closed. Another bookshop, toys, coffee, and scones, and some wear books, it might be well supposed, and mags, authors smiling from their covers at the register, chocolates, cards, and gum, and guilty pleasures moving back and forth between the browsers and the would-be lovers. As Jarrell knew, our lives are heading north. I walk around, circling demigods from previous lives, when syllables would sing the passions of my youth. They now seem odd. I hardly find a blessed thing I recognize, and so I genuflect in vain and finally come to one, on being blue, and then beside it, books on menopause, and there's a lovely travel guide to Spain. I get the hint. My vocation's a lost cause. Yet here I am. There's something lures me here, although the slender volumes I once loved have both begun to and may yet disappear. I search below, beneath, and then above. There's nothing much to do but pay and leave. Go home, watch TV. Nothing I hold dear is among what I've perused upon these shelves. There's not much point in staying here to grieve. I'll rest my faith among the gods and elves. Nowhere, à la recherche du temps perdu, that's Proust. How fortunate I am, how fortunate I can at least escape and leave, or do the old soft shoe. I look around, in the window, books on rape and tattoos, cults, chicken soup for the soul, crowd out the rest. Short stories by Colette aren't here, or sonnets by Edna Millay. But look, a book about the grassy knoll, from where it said they shot young JFK. I spent an hour in this dark domain. The croissant was delicious, that's for sure. I bought a book on how to purge a stain. Wise men have long observed that the impure is here on earth to keep the pure away. And so I just move on. It starts to rain. As luck would have it, a green umbrella's for sale besides the games the children play. I should thank God. I'm a lucky fellow. At last I find a way out of this mall. I've bought an ancient diary of Anne Frank, and on my phone a loud insistent call reminds me why I've turned into a crank. I think I'll stop en route, go buy some booze, then I'll be home, continue with my scrawls, paper to pen, unconnected to the web. These acts of mere resistance, what's the use? There's not much hope for one who's no celeb. Strange to think of ancient Homer tweeting, Shakespeare on Facebook, nothing that consoles. Off stage, I hear the constant bleating of Orwell's futuristic sheep. I have no role. Like the afflicted lining up at Lourdes, I'm left to contemplate the gods unseating, dream of salvation, succumb to dismay, like tulips floating on the icy fjords. I need to find another God to whom to pray. It's a little bit pessimistic.
I love
too
it.
pessimistic.
I love it. I love it. You can
But-
feel the entire thing. You can feel being in the bookstore. I can see the man. I just felt it from the first time I read it. I could feel that entire poem, and I just love it.
I think that's the way, there's a bookstore, it still exists in Washington, D.C., where I spend part of my time, and called Kramer Books. And it's a very good bookstore. And I remember when it started about 40, 45 years ago, it was just a bookstore. And then slowly coffee, and then slowly breakfast, and then lunch and dinner and booze. But it's still a good bookstore. But I think what has happened, you can't have a bookstore without a Starbucks in it
Yeah.
or a coffee.
Right.
And I think there's good things about that too, really. But I went into a bookstore, which will remain unnamed, in DC recently, but it has the word, well, I won't say much about it except that I went in to to the so-called poetry section, and well, I went in and there are just hundreds of people eating and drinking. It's like going into a restaurant, but there are books.
But there are books in the
but
corner.
very few of them.
Right. Oh my God. But
Very
nobody's
few of
reading
them,
any of them.
and very few of the ones I'd be looking for. So anyway, that's life.
Right. Right. And so what do you think about, I mean, I think about this a lot. Are you glad, speaking of Don't Die, are you glad, I'll start saying, I'm sort of glad that I lived in the time that I did, and that wouldn't be excited to be here in 30, 40 years. I mean, seriously, it's like, do you wish that you could do it all over right now, starting now?
No, I don't. I mean, it's a totally different world. I don't think, I'm not that old, and I don't feel old.
Right.
But I think somebody who is like my son's age can't grasp what it was once like. I mean, when I started writing, poets were like gods. There weren't that many of them. You knew who they were, the important ones. And bookstores were like churches, and publishers were like the deity, And I remember the first time I went into my publisher at the time was Viking Penguin, into their offices, and I looked in the waiting room. I looked in the windows of the books they published, and these were people, whose feet I would have kissed, and this was before, the great aphrodisiac for everything was being already famous. Yesterday, just on Fresh Air, there was Will Smith, who's a terrific actor, and seems like a terrific guy.
Yeah, I saw his interview yesterday on Oprah about his new memoir.
Well, he's a terrific person and he's a terrific actor. And I suppose his book is probably interesting, and it may even be terrific. I haven't read it. But it was a world before being famous meant everything. And being famous at one thing meant you could do anything. And so that just by being famous, you can write, you can publish your poems, whether it's John Lithgow publishing poems about Trump, or Jimmy Carter publishing his poems, or everybody writing a memoir, or a novel, or co-writing a novel,
Right.
Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton with other writers. It's a new world, and I don't know how I feel like I sort of signed on to a religion that doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
So,
It's so funny is that I lived, as you know, in Hollywood for 25 years, and lived in that world where fame is everything. I mean, it's such
right.
my husband grew up in DC, in his 30s and
Right.
40s, and I was in Hollywood, which was such an opposite world, both cities obsessed with themselves, but it's such different ideals. And I, thank God I got out of there. My best friends are there, and I love it. And it was an amazing experience, but it is, as my meditation teacher would say, a reality tunnel. And my dad would say, what's happening? I did some movies and TV and everything, but I never got hugely famous. And I would drive by. I remember driving on Sunset Boulevard and going, Daddy, I'm driving by a giant tent, and they're having a party for Divine Brown, who gave Hugh Grant a blowjob. And she's got publicists, and she's got this and that, and she is totally famous. And she could have written a book, and everybody would have,
They should have at least had Hugh Grant there, who got the pleasure.
Exactly. You might have been a guest now, but it's such a different world. And so when I came back here and had that whole experience, and then got more into the literary world, I've always written plays and put them up in LA, but really, I've always, my heroes have always been, since college, writers, but never really wanted to climb that ladder again, the fame ladder. And I wonder, sometimes I just think, as we're writing and putting out books, I used to just always, I don't know what I'm hoping for. Do you ever get confused and go, what are we doing? And say, why, are we hoping that somebody picks it up in 100 years? and loves it. And I do think I think that's what the most important thing about writing, the most important, if there is, for humanity, is to show what this world was like at this point in time.
Well, the whole thing is kind of shocking when I think about it, because books and culture, they invented the disposable razor. You shaved and you threw it away, and that was it. And now, I assumed, probably arrogantly, that I was writing for 100 years, that somebody would maybe pick up my poem, not all of them, but some of my poems, and read them to their grandchildren, when I'm long. And of course, those are the poems that I cared about. They weren't written this week. But the idea that a book, even a successful book, disappears in weeks, it's just kind of shocking, especially when you think poetry is something written for eternity. So why does it last 2 weeks in the bookstore? Why can people no longer get, not just my books, all kinds of books?
Right.
I went into an Amazon bookstore in DC a couple of weeks ago. I'd never been in an Amazon bookstore, and all the good bookstores are gone from DC, just about. There's not a bookstore in Georgetown except for this Amazon bookstore that I could see. And I went to the poetry section, and there was a big pile of Amanda Gorman, but no Howard Nemerov, no Anthony Heck, no Edna St. Vincent Millay, no Louise Bogan, no whoever, Louise Bogan, sorry. And so it's a different world. It's just a kind of shockingly different world.
But I still believe, and the most exciting thing as a publisher that I have is that, yeah, it disappears from the bookstore, it disappears from the media, it disappears from all of this, but it's there and out there. And when I publish, for instance, this is something I didn't publish, but my friend Claudia Love Mayer wrote this amazing book called Don't You Fall Now. And it's a memoir, and she describes falling into sort of a almost schizophrenic episode where her son jumps off, who is schizophrenic, jumps off a building. And that those moments walking into the hospital and coming in, and just her whole experience, the whole book, I teach it in my class a lot. And it's like, maybe there, I don't know how many copies were made. It was not a big publisher, but that book is out there and it's somewhere. And in 100 years, unless somebody burns everything and we blow up in a nuclear bomb, they're going to find that book and they're going to go, oh my gosh, this amazing writer in Kentucky wrote this about the struggles she's having and going into the hospital and saying, I have fibromyalgia, just this immediate fabulous writing is found. Like when we pick up something in a bookstore, and there's going to be bookstores, there's going to be people that I hope are reading all of the people from that you mentioned, and writers. It's the one thing that connects us immediately when you pick up a book to another human being. If anything, on any bookshelf of any old, when you come to visit, you have got to go to the Black Swan bookstore. Michael Courtney, my friend, it is such we're going to set up a reading, hopefully at the Carnegie Center. And you're going to stay at a little B&B, you and your wife. And then you will love the Black Swan bookstore. It is filled with everything that you could ever imagine. Michael Courtney's run it for 50 years. And it is, it's a dying breed, as you know, but still, at least I know they're out there. It is, I don't know, speaking of.
Well, it's, I think, the old saying that bad apples drive good apples out of circulation, it was true of books too. And I think you're right. A book can survive. Somebody can go into a used bookstore in 100 years and find a book, of which there are 6 copies left on the planet.
Right.
But it's overwhelming how easy it is to publish a book. You publish your own book, whatever. I look at these so-called publishing houses, and most of them are just vanity presses nowadays.
Right.
So the chances of a book surviving grow ever slimmer in the world where there are so many books. And it's kind of a mixed feeling. You know, I used to feel exhilaration going into a bookstore. And of course, the more successful, you know, if you walk into a bookstore and your book is on the table,
This is
you know, I
fabulous.
once gave a reading in Charlottesville, and I walked into the bookstore the morning of my reading, and I noticed there was like no mention of the reading in the window or anything, and there were all these John Grisham books. And then I walked into the bookstore. I was reading in about an hour. And I walked in the back. The bookstore said, "Why don't you go sign some of your books?" And I walked into the back, and there was John Grisham with piles of his books. Now, you know, I admire him in many ways. So this is not a put down of John Grisham, but you know, you can understand why there's this hunger for fame, because fame seems to get you so many things that mere talent won't get you. You would
Right.
like to think that talent would get you those things, but it
Right.
doesn't
Right.
sometimes.
Right.
So anyway, that's the world.
That is the world. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about your life, which is so fascinating. But growing up, your parents are Jewish immigrants into New York, correct?
I have lots of parents, but
You have lots
the
of parents,
two
but
that brought me
you're,
up, were immigrants, and the two that made me were also immigrants.
and they were cut, and it was the cousin, it was your aunt and
Right.
uncle were your actual birth parents, and they were
Right.
up the street, and you grew up thinking they were your cousins. And
Right.
that's why I said the memoir, All My Mothers and Fathers, is a fascinating history lesson on immigrants in America. And you had the quintessential. I had a mean stepdad myself who was a German immigrant that was a Marine and everything, but you had the quintessential mean stepmom to the very end, and it's just it is just an incredible insight. But what brought you to start living so much of your life in Europe? Was it because of it was where your parents came
Well,
from?
you know, to be honest, I think I probably have to give my wife credit for most of that. I mean, I always felt European. I grew up speaking German. I grew up in a ghetto of refugees. You know, I never had the slightest Leave It to Beaver or Donna Reed moment.
It was in New York, right? Was it in New
It
York?
was New York, but it was a ghetto. It was if you weren't a German Jewish refugee from the Holocaust, you were Puerto Rican, but there were no white Anglo-Saxon Protestants around.
Right, right.
And then, so I always felt like many Americans, American, but not that kind of American. And then I had been to Europe a bunch of times, but I married my wife, who's French, and that made my life more European, of course. And then I got a Fulbright to go to. I had visited Budapest in '86, and then I met somebody, and I got an invitation to come back there, and that sort of started what Helen Vendler referred to as my hijira. I'm not even sure how you pronounce that word, you know, which is people who wander around looking for a home,
Right.
which lasted many years. But I loved, I'm now a French citizen, also thanks to my wife.
Oh.
But yeah, that started a chain of events, which, you know, went from Hungary to Israel to France to Germany, and so on. So, and now and I at least spend a good almost half of the year at my little house in Hungary. My wife too, she spent some time at her very little house in France. People think we're rich. We have very little, very inexpensive places.
I remember you told me, and because that's always my dream. I love France, in the south of France. And I would love to have a little house there too. And then when,
Well,
and you were like, and you said the one thing which scares me, because you were like, well, you don't want to get sick over here. You don't want to get
well, in France, you're perfectly fine getting
not
sick.
in Hungary.
In Hungary, you're not as well off getting sick because doctors in Hungary are terribly paid, and the health system, most of the
One little
doctors.
doctor, there's one doctor that goes around the village every once a week or something.
We have a village doctor. She only comes to our village on Mondays from 1 to 2.
Oh, that's
But
so funny.
she's in the neighboring larger village in the mornings. But yeah, you don't really want to get my dear friend George Conrad got very, very sick, and he was a very famous and very well-known Hungarian a couple of years ago and died. And he didn't get the best medical care. If you get sick, you want to get sick in a country with universal medical care,
Right,
or you
right.
want to be very well insured in this country.
Right, exactly. Exactly. So what is the village that you all spend time with in France?
Well, that's my wife's life a little bit, and I get the American but we both love Hungary. Our little village in Hungary only has 270 people in it. It doesn't even have we still have one or two people with a horse and buggy, or a donkey and a buggy, going around. When I first got there, there were only 2 people in the village who had a fixed phone, so it's a small little village. There are no restaurants. Well, there are restaurants up on the mountain. The village itself only has a little ABC store. It had a bar. The bar closed. Has a little ABC store where you can buy bread and necessities, and
Oh my gosh.
and my wife's village is very small too. It's in the south of France, a village called Mane, M-A-N-E, and but it's more like the tourist image of France. It's beautiful and has beautiful old houses and
Mhm.
nice restaurant. I mean, good restaurants. But her little place is miles from the village, so her little place is even more remote than our little place in the village of Hedgemogosh. So those
Wow.
are both little
When are
places.
you going to go back? I know you
Well,
just got back, but when are you going to go
yeah,
back?
well,
Here?
we tend to go, I tend to go from about, if I can, from about May till October. And my
Oh,
wife spends some of that time with her sister and at her very, very, very small place, but beautifully located in the south of France. That was her mother's, actually. So, we're poor people who live like rich people,
well, that's my
sort of,
plan.
except for the spaces themselves.
Right.
But the itinerary seems like rich people.
Right. No, I get it 1000%. I want to do the same thing, but also I want to ask you, before we close out with another 1 or 2 poems, what are you working on now?
Ooh, that's the most painful, that's the most horrible question. Every writer, no, but I understand.
Yeah.
What am I working on now? Uh, you know, I could answer honestly and say nothing, but that's not quite true. Um, I tend to only write when I have to write. I'm not a great believer in, I mean, it's one thing for a novelist because that's real work you got to do. But I tend to write poems when I'm inspired to write poems. I think about writing all kinds of long things. I had a plan to write about primates, I wrote one book about baboons, but I wanted to write about them all, chimps and bonobos and orangutans. And now my son took over. Now he's the guy who's having the good time in Africa.
Oh,
But
wow. What's he doing over there?
he's working for a foundation, an NGO started by a French vet in
Oh,
Zambia. But I have a bad back, so that I had some back surgery, and walking is not fun for me. Everything else is fine, but walking is not fun. So it's kind of cut into some of my fantasies about because in addition to being self-involved, like many writers, I love nature and I love animals, and I wanted to write more about animals. So that's something I still want to do, I
Right.
guess. I hope.
I hope you write a book. I hope you'll write another nonfiction book or fiction, but that'll be interesting because I love your prose as well as your poems.
Well, I like it, gets you out of yourself. So it's a good thing to do. I'd like to do more of it too. Yeah. I'd like to write, maybe if we go visit our son in Zambia, I'll write something about Zambia.
Yes, good. Good. Okay. Let's say again, happy publication day with Don't Die. This
to you too. It's both of our day, right?
It's both of our day. And I'm
Right.
very, very, very proud of this book and excited about it. And we'll do in-person readings hopefully soon. You're doing an in-person reading Sunday. Where is that?
That's at the Writers Center in Bethesda, Washington, where 45 years ago I taught
Oh,
a class
wow.
at night. It was in a different location, but it's in the Writers Center, Bethesda, Maryland.
But they're very excited about that. Okay, so now I just opened this up to Budapest. Do you want to, since we were talking about, do you want to read that one?
What is it?
Budapest?
Yeah, what poem is it?
Oh, the poem is called Freedom.
Oh, I don't even know if I can find it.
Find it?
So why don't I read another, because I don't have the
Yeah, right.
book.
Well, okay, read another one. That was just
But
what
I'll read another poem. Since I mentioned my son in Africa.
Oh, yes,
uh,
yes.
I'll read a poem for my son. When you have kids, it's a wonderful thing to have kids, and I have a wonderful son. One of the bittersweet things is that your children get to do some of the things you wanted to do.
Mhm.
Your kids go out and have the life you didn't have, in part. So my son is in Zambia, and I wrote this for him when he left. It's called "For My Son Off to Africa." Now you will go and do what I would have done had I had myself for a father. You will go off into the world of elephants and primates, into a world of wildebeests and polecats and lechwas. You will come face to face with the greater kudu and the white rhinoceros, perhaps even the brown greater galago. And when you come across Liechtenstein's hartebeest or a Moorhall bush baby, you must promise me you will take a picture of them for your aging father. You will do as all sons must to outdistance their paternity and channel their father's dreams into the son's reality. You will become a better man than I ever was, holding the hand of your beloved and of this beautiful world, and walk out brazenly into the African sunset and tell them all I have sent you. Tell them your father says hello.
Mm. Love it. Beautiful, beautiful,
But I'm
beautiful.
going to go visit him, so.
Good. Yes, then I'm not fun. Oh my gosh, Michael, thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin. You made it possible.
I made it possible, and it's just the beginning. So now everybody can go out and get Don't Die, poems by Michael Blumenthal. And you can get it at rabbithousepress.com or your local bookstore, or if you choose Amazon and Barnes and Noble, online, Ingram, all of that. So I appreciate everybody that listened to us here at Rabbit House Press, and thank you, Michael Blumenthal. Mwah.
Thank you, Erin.
Okay, have a good
Be
day.
good. Okay, don't die.
I'll try not to.
Okay, we're all trying. Yeah.
You either. Bye.
Take care. Okay, bye.